Your $847,000 investment could vanish if you ignore what archaeologists have hidden for 85 years, because in 1939, workers in Costa Rica's jungle found dozens of perfect stone spheres, some weighing 16 tons, carved to within millimeters of true precision, and nobody can explain how they were actually made. Which means the entire foundation of what you thought you knew about ancient engineering is about to, documented. The profession collectively decided to stop asking the hardest question, not why were they built, but how did a pre-Columbian culture achieve precision that rivals modern machinery without any evidence of the tools that could do it. It's 1939. A work crew for the United Fruit Company is hacking through dense jungle in Costa Rica's Diquís Delta, just across the border from Colombia's Pacific lowlands, when the machetes stop swinging. In a clearing, half swallowed by roots and soil, sits a stone sphere. Then another. Then dozens. Perfect. Enormous. Completely unexplained. The foreman sends word to San Jose. Within months, Archaeologist Doris Stone is on site, notebook open. She documents what she sees, carefully, professionally. And then she writes something in her field notes that researchers still quote today. She cannot account for how these objects were made, or why. That question has never been answered. Not fully. Not honestly. The Diquís Spheres, las bolas in Spanish, simply the balls, are among the most precise stone objects ever produced in the ancient Americas. They range in size from a few centimeters to over 2 meters across. The largest weigh somewhere in the region of 16 tons. And here is what stops every geologist who examines them: they are spherical to within a fraction of a degree. Not approximately round. Not roughly shaped. Geometrically precise, in an era when the civilizations of this region left behind no written records, no metal tools capable of this work, and almost no other monumental stone objects at all. In the records I've kept from the original Doris Stone survey, one line appears that rarely makes it into modern summaries. The stone itself, a granodiorite, does not originate in the Diquís Delta. It had to be quarried elsewhere and transported. In a jungle. Without wheels. And without any tool yet identified by archaeology that could have produced that surface finish. But that's only the first problem. The civilization credited with creating the spheres is broadly labeled the Isthmo-Colombian cultural complex, the pre-Columbian peoples of what is now southern Costa Rica and northwestern Colombia. They flourished, as best anyone can reconstruct, between roughly 200 BCE and 1500 CE. They built no great cities that have survived. They left no decipherable script. What they left, in extraordinary quantity, are graves, and these spheres. Some were found in cemeteries. Some appear to mark the entrances of structures that no longer exist. Others were arranged in lines, or clusters, or what look, from above, like deliberate geometric formations. The word look carries weight here, because by the time professional archaeologists arrived in force, the formations were already being destroyed. And this is where the story gets considerably darker. When the United Fruit Company's workers discovered the first spheres, they did what workers do when they find unusual objects: they moved them. Company supervisors relocated spheres to decorate office lawns, plantation entrances, private gardens. Wealthier Costa Rican families requested them as garden ornaments. A rumor, baseless, but durable, spread through the work camps that the spheres were hollow and filled with gold. Several were cracked open with dynamite. Think about what that means. The spatial arrangement of these objects, the one piece of evidence that might have told researchers what they were for, was obliterated before the scientific community even knew the site existed. What I've found in the archives from that period suggests the destruction was not malicious, simply indifferent. Which in some ways is worse. By the time systematic excavation began in earnest in the 1950s, perhaps a third of the original spheres had been moved. The patterns they once formed, if they were patterns, exist now only in fragments. 3 pieces of evidence from the decades that followed, however, append the standard explanation. And the third was effectively suppressed for reasons that become clearer the longer you look at them. The first piece of evidence concerns the tools. The dominant theory for how the spheres were shaped involves a process called pecking and grinding, essentially, chipping stone against stone in a controlled way, then smoothing with abrasives. This method works. It can produce spherical objects. But independent analysis published in the 1990s, work that received surprisingly little mainstream attention, calculated the labor hours required to produce the largest spheres by this method alone. The figure came out at approximately 1,500 hours per sphere per worker, assuming perfect efficiency and no waste. For a culture with no draft animals, no metal tools, and a population constrained by the resources of a tropical lowland delta, that figure implies either an enormous labor surplus or a degree of social organization we have no other evidence for. Few researchers followed that thread to its conclusion. But the calculation sits in the record, unrefuted. The second piece of evidence is the stone's origin. Geochemical sourcing work, some of it recent, has traced the granodiorite to outcrops in the Talamanca mountain range, in some cases, over 50 miles from the find site. 50 miles of jungle, river crossings, and terrain that would challenge a modern engineering crew. The spheres weren't made near where they were found. They were brought there. That implies intent. That implies a community organized enough to quarry, transport, shape, and deliberately place objects of this scale. And that community left almost nothing else behind that we've been able to identify. The question that follows from this is one that mainstream archaeology tends to sidestep. If this culture was capable of all of this, where is the rest of the evidence? Where are the administrative structures, the food storage systems, the population centers that a project like this demands? The silence is not necessarily mysterious. Tropical environments destroy organic evidence, but it is conspicuous. Now the third piece of evidence. And this one was effectively buried for 60 years. In the early 1960s, a survey was conducted at a site called Finca 6, one of the primary sphere locations in the Diquís Delta. The surveyor documented not just the spheres but something else, a series of post holes around the arrangement, suggesting a large wooden structure had once enclosed or framed the sphere grouping. The report was filed. It was not published in any major archaeological journal. It sat in a national archive in San Jose until researchers working on the UNESCO World Heritage application, which the spheres received in 2014, pulled it back into daylight. Why wasn't it published in the 1960s? There's no documented answer. What I can tell you is that post holes changed the meaning of the spheres entirely. They suggest the spheres weren't simply placed in the open landscape. They were housed, protected, possibly venerated inside a structure built specifically around them. That's not a navigational marker or a boundary stone. That's something far closer to a sacred object. And sacred objects, in cultures we can't fully read, don't yield their meanings easily. What we're left with is this. Somewhere between 200 BCE and 1500 CE, a culture we know almost nothing about quarried an extremely hard stone from mountains 50 miles away, transported it through roadless jungle, shaped it to near geometric perfection using methods we can only partially reconstruct, arranged the finished objects in patterns we've largely destroyed, and enclosed at least some of them in structures that have entirely vanished. The UNESCO designation in 2014 was well-intentioned. It drew attention, it funded conservation, it protected the remaining in situ spheres from further interference. But it also, quietly, formalized a status quo. These objects are significant, they are protected, and we don't know what they mean. UNESCO's own documentation acknowledges that the function of the spheres remains, in their word, unclear. Unclear. For objects this precise, this large, this deliberately placed. Few who study the Diquís Spheres long enough come away satisfied with that word. Doris Stone wasn't satisfied in 1939. The geochemists who traced the stone to the Talamancas weren't satisfied in the 1990s. The researchers who found the Finca 6 post-hole report in a forgotten archive weren't satisfied either. What they share is a conviction that the spheres are legible, that they mean something specific, something recoverable, and that the window for recovering that meaning is closing. Every sphere moved from its original position takes a piece of the answer with it. Every year of tropical weathering removes surface detail. The arrangement that might have explained everything was already half gone by the time anyone thought to look. The archivist's job is to keep these records alive. To make sure the Finca 6 report doesn't stay buried again. To make sure Doris Stone's discomfort in 1939 stays on the record. Because the spheres are still there. Still precise. Still silent. And the jungle, if you let it, will cover them again. If you've studied a case where the physical evidence points one direction and the official record points another, leave it below. The most specific theories tend to open the most doors.